Now we're ready for a relatively light reading on business cycles. So we've gone through and done some more advanced analysis. I think this is actually a pretty approachable reading, something that you probably have good intuition about many of the concepts already. So what you need to do is make sure you're putting all those together and that you are on top of the terminology and those types of things. So very light on the calculations, heavy on the intuition, but overall it is something that you've likely seen or at least thought about previously if you are a typical CFA candidate. So let's just jump in. What we're talking about here is business cycles or business cycle theory, or what causes the business cycles, or how we're supposed to react to them, all those types of things. Looking at the business cycle, well, if you've ever had a macroeconomics class, then you've certainly seen this curve before. So what we're comparing here on the vertical axis is going to be real GDP. So this is the change in GDP, and we're looking at it through time. So as you know, we cycle up, then this would be called the peak up here, and then as we cycle down, this would be called the trough. And the notion with this is that this one causes lots of misery as when we're in the trough, but also is one of the earmarks of a capitalistic economy. So you see lots of, that's where you see business cycles, is in market economies, and we've talked about different types of economic involvement in the macroeconomy. Well, when we talk about something like Keynesian economics, which we'll discuss a little bit, what we're trying to do is maybe take the top out of the peak so that we can then take the bottom out of the trough, and something like that to smooth out the economic cycles over time is normally a common goal of policymakers. So that's what the business cycle looks like. All we're talking about is this, for the most part, unexplicable undulation in business activity. Business heats up and then it cools off and it heats up again. And we have some theories about why that occurs, but I don't think, given how basic it is, I don't think we have a particularly good understanding of what drives it. Now, what we can see through the cycle is changes in this ratio. Okay, inventory over sales. So, in a contraction, of course, sales are going to slow down, and that's going to cause an unexpected increase in inventory. So the inventory over sales ratio is going to be above normal, right? So you're going to have, inventory building up and sales falling. You actually get an increase in the numerator and a decrease in the denominator. That makes the ratio go up when we are going down into a contraction or heading down towards the trough. On the other hand, if we're in expansion period, okay, well, what happens initially is sales kind of jump unexpectedly. So, we're at the bottom, we're coming out. Hey, we got more orders than we this week than we did last week. Okay, well, that causes an unplanned decrease in inventory. So suddenly we're decreasing inventories faster than we expected. And of course, sales are growing if you have an unexplained sales increase. So we've got inventory shrinking, the numerator shrinking, the denominator is growing. And that means that in the expansion, in particular, as we come out of the trough, this ratio is going to be lower than it would be on average if you measured it across the cycle. So this is one way of describing what's going on with the business cycle. There are many economists that would say that the inventory is the business cycle, in the sense of, well, we build up inventory as we go into as we finish with the peak, and then the recession is basically what happens as we try to shed employees and try to bring inventory levels back down, and then we go back, once we finally get them down, we turn back up, and then inventory levels are too low, so we are speeding along then, trying to hire new employees and be able to build our inventories back up. So that would be one theory behind why the business cycle is what it is. All right, so capital and labor utilization. So what we see is that firms are actually slow to hire. They're also slow to lay off employees. They also tend to be slow in terms of increasing or decreasing their physical capital. Adjustments in both of those areas are costly, right? So if you want to increase physical capital, you've got to go out and raise money. If you want to decrease it, then you're taking losses. If you're hiring people, you are making long-term commitments, even though they're not legally binding, but no one likes the idea of laying off employees. And of course, if you lay them off, then that's not something you want to do either, so they tend to make those decisions slowly. Well, what we see is that the beginning of a contraction, okay, when we see that we are in or going into recession, sales fall. Well, if we're selling less, then what do? Well, we use both the inputs, that is labor and capital, less intensively. On the opposite side, when we go into the expansion, sales are increasing, the the attitudes of the players in the market is improving, and we end up with those higher sales leading to both labor and capital being used at a higher rate or being more intensively employed. So, we can see that it takes some time for the markets to adjust. So as we come off the peak, okay, well, things don't happen immediately, right? And as we come out of the trough, well, it takes some time to make these adjustments. So these adjustments are relatively slow through time. So what we see here are the different business cycle theories. So I talked about this idea of inventory, and it really is not a theory. It's more of a description of the process that we go through. You know, inventory buildup, and then we have to bring it down as we go into the recession, and then we have to build it back up with the unexpected sales increase. But what's the root cause underneath that? Well, it depends on which economist you're talking to. So what we see here on this slide and the next slide are some of the thinking behind what causes the business cycle. And on the back end then, what would be the policy? So if you buy into a particular school of thought in terms of what causes the business cycle, what would be the appropriate policy to follow given that particular business cycle or business cycle underpinning. So the first one here is the neoclassical theory. The neoclassical theory basically says that there are some real things out there in terms of, you know, expectations and productive capacity, but it's really these technology changes that are driving the business cycle. So technology ramps up and makes us much more productive for a while and then slows down, and so we have this change in technology that actually induces the business cycle. And the point here is we're going to see one of what I would call 2.5 different responses. So this is, I'll tell you why it's a half in just a moment. But anyway, so think of it as one of 2 responses, or maybe 3, depending on how you look at it. And that would be to allow wages and prices to adjust. So we've got the market. We have a market mechanism. When we are below full employment, that puts downward pressure on wages, and eventually that's going to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve out. We'll see some examples of that in just a little while. And then when we are at over full employment, the opposite happens. It puts upward pressure on wages, and that shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve back in. In other words, the economy is self-correcting. All right, so that is the neoclassical thought. We're going to contrast that with the other major school of thought here being the Keynesian or the New Keynesian. So and the Keynes is famous for the statement, in the long run, we're all dead. And what he meant by that was, given that wages are downward sticky, okay, meaning that sure, wages will fall in a recession, but that recession has got to be really long and really deep. Or if you're a New Keynesian, that there are other inputs, okay, that are also going to have downward sticky prices. It takes a long time for prices, for wages and prices to adjust. And if you're thinking, oh, well, in the long run they'll adjust, then Keynes would say you're right, but also in the long run, we're all dead. Right? So anyway, Keynes' notion is, no, we don't let the market adjust on its own. We're going to use either fiscal, okay, and or monetary policy to restore full employment. So if you look at the central bankers and governments of the world and you witness some sort of international economic deterioration, economic condition deterioration, what you see is there may be a lot of schools of thought out there, but it sure seems like those people in power often are Keynesians, right? So and that's probably, you can think of that as the 2 ends of the spectrum. You know, you either let the market mechanism work, or you jump in with counter-cyclical monetary or fiscal policy. So Keynes versus the classical, or in this case the neoclassical theory, is the dichotomy that we're looking at for the most part. Now, and I said there's 2.5 theories. This would be my half, okay? That is the monetarists. So the monetarists would argue that the business cycle is caused by inappropriate changes in the money supply. So giving the monetary authority discretion over the money supply, so in the United States, the Federal Reserve, and they're going to go in and they're going to monkey with this and they're going to mess it up, right? So inappropriate changes are what induce the business cycle. So the policy here is to have a steady and predictable growth in the rate or growth rate in the supply of money. And the easiest way to characterize this, and there's some more complexity behind this, but it's not part of the curriculum, would be to say, hey, let's look at the long run growth rate in the economy. So not the short run, that's all the ups and downs, and over time it's going to be some sort of long-run average. So let's look at the long-run average in the economy, okay, the growth in the economy, and set that equal to the growth rate in the money supply. So there's always enough money over time to support the level of expenditures that we have in the economy. That would be the recommended policy. So this one says this is much closer to the neoclassical or the new classical theory, which we see on this slide. That is, let the economy self-correct, but in particular, we're not going to use counter-cyclical monetary policy. What we want is a nice, smooth, upward growth rate in the money supply. Now, as something that has become very popular in some circles as of late is this idea of Austrian economics. And Austrian economics is sometimes talked about like it's a completely different way of thinking about economics. I don't think that's true. The supply curve is still upward sloping. Anyway, the point here is that the view of the Austrian economics school is that government intervention is what causes the business cycle. So if you could keep the governments out of meddling in the economy, then we wouldn't have business cycles. So in particular, they focus on the idea of not forcing interest rates to some artificially low level. And we've seen lots of increase in the people that would call themselves adherents of Austrian economics in recent periods, just because of the idea that we could have had the economic meltdown that we saw sort of worldwide a few years ago was maybe induced by artificially low levels of interest rates. Now, I'm not a particular adherent to that idea, but nonetheless, that's the Austrian economics. And then finally down here, the new classical. Okay, new classical, this is also called real business cycle theory. And what that says is, hey, those ups and downs in the economy, okay, they are rational responses to external supply shocks and then, of course, technology changes. So what you should do is leave the economy alone. So what we basically have is we got one group that says, leave the economy alone, but tells us what to do with the money supply. Okay? Then we have a number that say, don't mess with the economy. Okay? I would put the Austrian school in there, the neoclassical, the new classical. And then we have the Keynesians who say, in the long run, we're all dead. So what you want to do is use counter-cyclical monetary and fiscal policy in order to return us to full equilibrium or full employment. Now, which of these schools are right? Of course, nobody knows. That's not the point. Your point is to be able to, or your job is to be able to read a brief description and then, determine which school is at play in a question on the exam, or to read, a couple of statements and see if both of those are accurate in describing one school or another. All right? So business cycle theory might take a little more time to get on top of just because there's a number of definitions there. Okay, so let's look at types of unemployment. And this is actually a fairly important slide. And what we see here are three types of unemployment. Okay, so we have one up here, that's going to be frictional unemployment. So frictional unemployment is just the unemployment that occurs because if you end up out of work, it takes a little while to get back into work. So if you have a spouse or significant other, they end up taking a job in another city, you quit yours to go with them, then it's going to take 6 or 8 weeks in order to find a job. Well, that is frictional unemployment. We're not particularly concerned about frictional unemployment. There's nothing we can really do about it, but it also doesn't cause any particular problems. Okay, there's also, and the nastiest of these is actually structural unemployment. So structural unemployment results from long-term changes in the economy that basically cause a divergence between the skill set of workers and the skill set needed or demanded by employers. So we have people that are willing to hire, we have people that are willing to work, but there's not a match-up in the skill sets. Now, interestingly, we're not really worried about this in terms of a discussion of macroeconomics and macroeconomic policy. This is more of a question of how do we go about retraining a labor force. So that would have to do more with social or economic policy than it would, the strict application of, monetary and fiscal policy and what's going on with inflation and those types of things. So we're not really worried about frictional. Structural is particularly nasty, but not, at least not wholly addressed in a discussion of macroeconomics. So what we see here is the one that we're going to worry about the most is this cyclical unemployment. So this is unemployment that results from changes in economic growth. And you can think of this as the definition of full employment is where cyclical unemployment is equal to zero. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has a job, because we could still have some frictional unemployment. We could still have some structural unemployment, okay? But there's no unemployment in the economy that comes from the cyclical nature of business activity. That's the idea of full employment. So let me state that again. It wasn't particularly graceful. So full employment says we are at zero cyclical unemployment. So there still could be some unemployment out there, structural and frictional, but there isn't any that is induced purely by the undulations in business activity in the economy. So types of unemployment, it's the cyclical one that we're going to be most worried about. Now, if we're worried about cyclical unemployment or unemployment generally, then of course we have to have some way to measure that, right? So how do you measure unemployment? And this is done with slight differences from country to country. So you have to be a little bit careful in comparing one country to another. But the basic idea is that just because you are out of work does not mean you are unemployed. So it might just mean in the United States, for instance, that you're a redneck, right? So anyway, so a person that has to be available to work, okay, and actively looking for work in order to be unemployed. So I scratched that out. I'll put in a better line there. So they got to be available and actively looking. The definition goes a little beyond that, but you can think of it in those terms. If they are not actively looking, then they would not be counted as unemployed. The labor force is the sum of those who are employed and those who are unemployed. So that would be, you know, the people that are either working or the people that are able to work and actively looking for work together. And the unemployment rate, of course, is the number unemployed divided by the labor force. So you can see that what would happen if we had workers become discouraged, right? So if we decreased this by, 10 workers, okay, and that also, so people were unemployed, but then they gave up. Those are called discouraged workers. We see that actually on the next slide. Well, if that decreases by 10 and this goes down by 10, okay, well, what's going to happen here? Well, this is like the ratio analysis in the FSA material, and that says that, hey, well, which of these numbers are bigger? Well, if we have a change of 10 people in each of these, then the smaller number is going to have a bigger proportional impact. So even though the numerator and the denominator are going down, the unemployment rate is not unchanged, right? Why? Because this is going to have a bigger proportional response to a decrease of 10 people because the number was smaller to begin with. So what we would see if you have workers become discouraged, okay, is that the unemployment rate would fall. So we might think things are going better even though they're not. So you see the unemployment rate vary in ways that you wouldn't expect sometimes in a business cycle. So the unemployment rate doesn't always fully describe the amount of misery out there is the point. There's also the participation rate, or participation ratio. That is the labor force divided by the working age population. And of course, the same thing here. So as people exit the labor force because of discouragement, which is the last bullet point down here, then we would have a decrease here with no corresponding decrease here. Just because you are discouraged doesn't mean that you are not a working age, right? So if you're over 16, you're basically working age. So the participation ratio will result, it's easy to interpret. If we have people become discouraged, then the participation ratio is going to fall. So anyway, so the participation ratio here and the impact of discouraged workers, those who are no longer looking for a job, they're just sitting at home and eating bonbons and watching television or whatever it happens to be. So unemployment measures, you want to keep a handle on those. A couple of terms here. So you're probably familiar with at least two of these terms. You've talked about inflation probably. You've talked about deflation. So inflation, as you would expect, is just this persistent increase in the price level. The inflation rate is the percentage increase. Okay, so we usually measure that on a yearly basis. Deflation is where we have a decrease in prices through time. So it's a negative inflation rate. What might not be as common to you is this idea of disinflation. So disinflation is where we are expecting one inflation rate, we're expecting 3% inflation, and inflation only ends up being 1%. So it's still positive. Prices are still going up, but at a lower rate than what was expected or what is the historical average, if you want to think of it that way. So oftentimes when we look at economic models and we look at, say price versus quantity, and we say, oh, well, here's what's going to happen. The price level is going to fall in response to this. Well, that intuitively would lead you to think, oh, well, price level is going to fall. That means that we're going to have deflation. Well, in many cases, for what would be interpretable in the real world, that's probably better thought of as something that induces disinflation. So we don't actually see the price level fall. We see the rate at which prices are increasing slowed by the phenomenon that we're discussing. We're talking about prices and quantity. And of course, hyperinflation, this is just, big time inflation, right? So it's out of control, high inflation, all that sort of stuff. We've seen that you don't have to look very far back into history or probably forward into history if you had a crystal ball to see hyperinflationary economies. Okay, so now thinking of inflation, how are we going to measure inflation? Well, we're going to measure inflation with a price index, and that's just going to be a weighted average of goods and services that we can purchase in the economy. So there's a number of ways to calculate this. But what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, what do those goods cost today? And then we're going to compare it to what they cost yesterday or last year or in a base year. So you would see developed economies periodically change the base year. It doesn't happen very often, but maybe we're comparing back to 1987. What are prices today? Well, we can see the price change over that time. We can also, the way we structure the index, we can look at it from one period to the next, but we got to have some sort of base year to start all this. So the most common measure in the United States, the most commonly used measure, is the Consumer Price Index, and this measures a fixed basket of goods. That fixed basket is going to be important in just a moment because we're going to talk about the alternatives to having a fixed basket of goods. But quite literally what goes on is we're going to go out and we're going to say, well, here's a basket of goods that is going to be relatively carefully chosen. It's going to be a pound of hamburger meat. It's going to be a pound of chicken breast. It's going to be, 30 or 40 other things. And in the United States, the way this is done is they go to a number of cities and a number of outlets in each of those cities, and then every month, and they say, what would it cost to buy this good at this outlet? And then they aggregate that up and find the price. Well, the consumer price index, okay, is going to be the value of that basket at a particular point in time. Changes in the consumer price index, as we see here. So we've gone through, we looked at the base period, we compare that to the current period. Okay, that's going to give us a consumer price index. Okay, that is the level of prices today. And you can see that we're taking the cost of the basket at current prices. That's in the numerator. Okay, so if we have inflation, this is going to be bigger than the base year prices. So that might be something like 1987. We're going to multiply it by 100. That's just the way we standardize it. So in the very first year, the value of the index was 100. So in this case, what we get is 29 over 25. So we get a CPI of 116. And what that says is, over this period, from the base to today, we've seen a 16% increase in price of goods. We could also look at it in sort of a holding period return. If last year it was 114, it went up to 116 this year, well, we take 116 over 114 minus 1. That would tell us the change in the value of the, change in the price level for a single period. So this compares it all the way back to the base year, but if we look at yearly changes in that, we can also infer what's going on a yearly basis for inflation as indicated by this consumer price index. Now, there are other indices out there, right? So there's the price index for personal consumption expenditures, and I always thought this was terribly named because what they do here is they survey businesses instead of consumers. So if you're thinking about personal consumption, it seems like you ought to talk to people, but instead you talk to businesses, so this is looking at it from the other side. The GDP deflator is described elsewhere in the curriculum, but basically it is just it looks like a CPI. So it's price of goods today over price of goods in the past. And then if we want to take goods today and deflate them, then we divide by the GDP deflator. So we've seen that elsewhere. There's also a producer's price index, which looks at, the raw materials, intermediate goods, that sort of thing. So if we're looking for changes in the price of goods for the used in the production process, well, that would be another way to look at inflation. So the number of ways to measure that. Now, we're also worried about the impact of short-term volatility. So if you want to know what's going on with inflation, if you put energy, that is, a price of a gallon of gas, into the index, well, energy is a particularly volatile commodity. That is, well, of course, energy is a volatile commodity, or gas is a volatile commodity. That's obvious, right, in more than one sense, okay? But the price of gasoline is volatile, so it goes up and it goes down a lot. So what we're going to see is an index that includes gasoline is likely to be up one period because of gas prices are up, and then down another period because of the impact of gasoline. And it doesn't really have as much to do with the core level of inflation in the economy. So the way we divide this out is we have two measures. We have a headline measure, which would measure all goods and services in the economy. It would be a sampling, but that's what we're trying to measure with headline inflation. What is more commonly reported, even if they don't disclose that, is this idea of core inflation, which in particular excludes food and energy, and it does so because these have lots of short-term fluctuations in price. So lots of short-term fluctuation in both of these things. So we're trying to understand the trend in prices over time, and we're trying to get away from, with the core inflation, we're trying to get away from the idea of just underlying volatility in the price of these particular commodities. Okay, what about limitations? And I think this actually makes great test question stuff, so you'll probably want to make sure that you're on top of this. But the notion is that CPI is widely believed to overstate the true inflation rate. So if we look at CPI and we say, well, inflation was 3%, then what actual inflation might have been, if we could observe truth, might have only been 2%. So CPI is overstating inflation, which of course is problematic in the sense that, well, there's union contracts that have, CPI adjustment clauses. We call that a COLA clause, right? Cost of living adjustment. Well, if real inflation is 2%, and we base the increase in the cost of labor on a 3% increase, well, that has a self-fulfilling mechanism to it, right? It's compounding itself into the price of goods. So the notion of overstatement here is something that economists take seriously. And where does that come from? Well, it comes from a number of places. Okay, one, while we tried to control for the quality of goods in the basket, thinking of CPI, that there might be changes in quality through time that we are not controlling for. So maybe it's the case that a pound of or chicken breast is different today than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago because of growth hormones, and so there's more meat, and the meat to bone ratio is better or something. I don't know what that would be. I'm not claiming that's the case, but nonetheless, that would be maybe a quality improvement depending on your view of growth hormones. So anyway, there's some sort of quality change there that we are ignoring in the price change. Also, there are new goods that replace older goods in the basket. So as we change what's in the basket, that's going to have some impact. And then finally, and the one that I think I would focus on the most, okay, and this is the idea of substitution. So if we look at a basket of goods and it has 40 different things in it, well, if we say that the price of the basket increased by 5%, well, that's great. If you bought whatever the fixed quantity of that in that basket is, if you bought that same fixed quantity through time, prices have gone up 5%. But remember that in that basket there's 40 goods. The average price increase is 5%. That means some have increased by 7 and others have only increased by 2 or 3. Well, what happens when that occurs? Okay, we are rational economic agents. Okay, if the relative prices of things have changed and they are substitutes for each other, so the price of beef goes up, the price of chicken goes down in a relative sense, then what do? We eat less beef and more chicken, and so we can substitute within the basket, and that mutes the impact of CPI on our personal budgets or the general price level. So the substitution effect is not accounted for in the way we calculate CPI. So CPI is calculated using what's called a Lapras index. So that just says, hey, we've got this fixed quantity of goods and we're going to measure them through time. A Pache, I think that I knew this when I started. Pache, that is, there it is. Pache index, and if you're good with those, the thing to remember there is you just say the name like you know what you're talking about. Everyone around you will assume that you know. Anyway, so the Pache index here uses a slightly different scheme, and that is it uses the basket weights from the current period. So in other words, what are we buying today? How much of each of those goods are we buying today? And then it compares the cost of that quantity to the base period and to the current period. So rather than having a fixed amount, it says, well, what are we consuming this period? Are we consuming, more chicken and less beef? well, then we're going to have use those weights in our consumption bundle and see how that weighting would have changed through time. So what we're doing here is creating, in general terms, what is called a chained price index, and that is the point here is to reduce the bias from this substitution effect. And then there's ways we could do, a Fisher index is a geometric mean of these two. I don't know that I don't think the LOS doesn't say you need to calculate these things, but the idea of a chained index, okay, is something that is accounting for the substitution. So we're allowing for the fact that what we buy in the basket changes through time. So if you want to know how prices have changed for the consumer today, you look at what they're consuming today. That is the weights, and you look at what those weights would have cost you in the base period and what those weights would have cost you today, and look at the difference. So we're trying to back out the substitution impact is the point here. All right. And I accidentally punched the wrong button there. So there we go. Back to the chained index. All right. So I think this is one of those great thought questions that I'd be on top of. So what are the limitations of the CPI? There were several. The big one was the substitution. Well, what is the substitution problem? How does it manifest itself in the CPI index, that is in a LEPRS index, okay? And then how does that differ in a chained index, the notion that we are controlling for the substitution effect. Okay, so factors that affect price level, okay, two kinds of inflation, right? So cost push, okay, also called wage push inflation, and then demand pull inflation. So cost push, you can think of this as some sort of external, meaning exogenous or external to the economy price shock. So the price of oil suddenly jumps for some reason. So economists love to talk about the 1973 oil embargo in the United States. So the price of oil shot up overnight essentially, and that imposed this price shock on this very pervasive input into our production process. Demand pull, on the other hand, means that we as consumers are demanding more and more goods, so we are going to demand more of those goods. In that process, we're going to bid up the price of the goods, and that's going to lead us to an aggregate demand level that is above the full employment level, which of course is going to be inflationary. So we can see it in these graphs. We've looked at the short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, and the aggregate demand curve in other readings. But if we are at equilibrium here, so you can see that the world is in harmony. So we're right here at this equilibrium that excites economists so much. Well, if we have cost push inflation, that means that costs are going to be shocked up. Well, if it's suddenly more expensive to produce, what's going to happen to this short-run aggregate supply curve? Well, it's going to shift in that direction, right? So when that shifts, so we're going to be producing less at any given price level. So we move in here. Okay, and of course, there's some sort of, resource constraint that did this. Well, what happened? Well, we were down here at P1. Now we're up here at P2. Okay, that is a price increase, that is inflation, right? Prices are going up. So now we've also mentioned the concept elsewhere of stagflation, which just says, hey, this is a really hard thing to deal with because what we can manipulate most easily, in the short run anyway, would be demand. So we could bring demand down, okay, and control the inflation, right? So we could get back to the original price level. Now, the trouble with that is, having people out of work isn't any fun. Okay, we could also get people back to work perhaps by, shifting the aggregate demand curve this way. But what's the problem with that? Well, that's going to lead to even more inflation. So stagflation is just this environment where we are below full employment, and we can't address both the inflation problems and the unemployment or the recession problem at the same time. So we are at this, we're down here below full employment. That is cost push inflation, right? So we have this cost push inflation, and eventually, if we move this aggregate demand curve out, which is probably the solution that most politicians would look for, we're going to maybe get back to full employment. Okay, but we're also going to end up with this higher level of inflation. So cost push inflation, the cost exogenous to the system jumped up, and that shock in prices shifted the supply curve in, and then finally, as we shifted back, we ended up with higher prices still. Now, demand pull inflation is going to work exactly the opposite. So for whatever reason, you and I as consumers are going to become more and more optimistic, and we are going to start demanding more goods, and that is going to bid up the prices of those goods, is what this is basically saying. So we're going to shift this way, so shift the aggregate demand curve out. increase in the money supply, government spending, all that sort of stuff. The problem here is now we are at overfull employment, right? So this is not a sustainable thing. If you're producing here at GDP2, the only way to do that is to have people working double shifts and, call people out of retirement or keep people from retiring, all of which means that you're going to pay them more. So that's going to put upward pressure on wages, and that's going to shift us back in this way. So eventually, we are going to come back to full employment. Under any system, that's the eventual outcome. That was Keynes versus the neoclassical argument. Keynes would admit this would happen in the long run. It's just that it takes too long. So anyway, but the point is we started with prices down here. Once we got back to our adjusted level, equilibrium employment level, then we have higher prices. That's demand pull inflation. Okay, what about the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment? Okay, so the non-accelerating inflation rate. This just means the lowest unemployment rate that we can have that's not going to induce this wage push inflation. So if unemployment gets too low, then that's going to lead to, I guess you can think of it as the labor market being a seller's market, and that's going to put upward pressure on wages. Okay, this is called the natural rate of unemployment. Probably varies from country to country, and it might not be the same as having zero cyclical unemployment. So there could be some room between, well, the curve may bend at some point, if that makes any sense. So we're going to see that, instead of being like that, right, so an unemployment rate will kind of gradually come up. So it's these kind of curved relationships that you would see in graphs that make the difference. But that doesn't make any sense. What I would focus on here is the idea that we have a natural rate of unemployment, and at the natural rate of unemployment, that is not going to tend to increase inflation. It's not going to lead to this wage push inflation. Okay, so now we've talked about inflation, we talked about unemployment, and we started out talking about the business cycle. So now we are back to the business cycle, and we're going to talk about how to think about where we are at in the business cycle and how things are changing. So what's really great if you're an analyst is to know when you're at the top and when you're at the bottom, because when you're at the top, you want to buy one type of asset. When you're at the bottom, you want to buy another. Well, we have indicators, so indicators of economic activity. So they come in three classes. That is leading indicators, coincident indicators, and lagged indicators. So the leading indicators, leading here doesn't mean best, it means leading in time, right? So these are things that precede business cycle changes. That is, they precede the business cycle peak or the troughs. And this is far from an exact science, all right? But what is it that we're going to see change? If we're at the peak and things haven't started to go down yet, but we're going to see these things starting to change, well, that's going to be a leading indicator. Same at the bottom or at the trough. Okay, well, the work week, right? So how many hours are the manufacturer employees getting? New orders. Okay, vendor performance. So how long does it take them to get orders there? Well, when you're at the top, okay, the vendors are slow, right? So if their performance starts to improve, then that would be an indication that maybe business is lightening up a little bit, even if you have to back up the supply chain to see it. Stock prices, of course, stock prices are a leading indicator. Remember, it's not an exact science, so, changes in stock prices have successfully predicted 9 of the last 4 recessions. So we've had stock prices fall and then no recession materialize. The yield curve will tend to flatten as we move into a recession. Unemployment insurance claims are going to start up. And you can see the rest of these things are going to go as well. So anyway, so the notion here is that we have all of these things that are going to lead changes in the economic cycle. So they're going to turn first when we go down, and they'll turn first when we come back up. There are also indicators that change with the business cycle. So that's, our payrolls, okay, industrial production, personal income after you take out transfer payments, and then manufacturing and trade sales. Okay, all those things tend to go down as the economy starts down and go back up as the economy starts to go up. So they're coincident, right? And then finally, we have lagging indicators. So a lagging indicator would tell us, hey, we've observed some leading indicators that made us think this was changing or this was changing, and then we observed the coincident changes, so that would say, okay, then finally we observed the lagging indicators. Well, now we have all 3 of these things working in the right direction. Notice that unemployment is a lagging indicator. Okay, that means that it is, so if we're in a trough and we have high unemployment, well, if we're looking at unemployment numbers every month and we're saying unemployment isn't improving, therefore we're not coming out of the recession, that's not necessarily the case. We wouldn't expect unemployment to start increasing until, or excuse me, to start decreasing until after we were already in the recovery, and that's because of these discouraged employees suddenly become not discouraged, and they go from not being counted as unemployed to being counted as unemployed when they start looking for a job again, right? So unemployment is a lagging indicator. But you can also see, we have the inventory sales ratio and, CPI for services. So the CPI for services starts to go up as we come out of the recession and the like. So leading, coincident, and lagging indicators, something that you want to be on top of. As a quick question here, so this wouldn't be, this is not as easy as it might seem. So put a question in here for you. So here's what's happening with the indicators. So we have payroll is increasing. Okay, well, what does that tell us? Manufacturing orders are decreasing. Okay, the average prime rate is increasing, so rates are still going up, but the yield curve is flattening, and the inventory sales ratios are increasing, right? So inventories are going up faster than sales. Okay, where are we in the business cycle? So you've got to remember that you got to look at which of these are going to be leading, okay, which could be changing currently as we're observing these, and which would we not expect to have changed yet. So you have to know which of these are leading and which of these are lagging in order to be able to see what's going on. But so if we're going to label all these, going back to the last, well, not the last 3 slides, but the last 4 slides minus the last one, to see if these were leading or lagging. Well, remember, prime rates increasing, okay, those are lagging indicators. So that wouldn't be predicting a change in the business cycle right now. The same with the inventory sales ratio. Okay, coincident, that's going to be payroll increasing. What are the leading indicators here? So we still have payroll increasing, right, at this moment, okay, and then we have new orders decreasing and the yield curve flattening. So the leading indicators tell us that we are headed down. Okay, this says that we are currently, not doing well, but this would be something that would be evident in what is currently a robust economy, which means looking at those 3, we're going to be up here somewhere, but the leading indicators say we're about to fall, so we must be at the peak, right? So anyway, so being able to go through all those requires some significant understanding of which way they're going to move, and also being able to go through and label them and then think through, well, what would we observe yet? Well, the prime rates are, still are increasing. Well, yeah, they're going to be increasing until we get well into whatever the changed phase is. The same with the inventory sales ratios. So you got to think, what's changing right now? Okay, what is the state of the world right now? Does that tell us that we're high, or does that tell us we're low? And then the leading will tell us, are we about to see this change from up to down, or from, down to up? So that is going into the trough, or going into recession, or coming out with a recovery. Okay, well, that wasn't too bad. So most of this stuff you probably have some intuitive understanding of. There's a lot of terminology here. You got to get on top of maybe a few new concepts. You got to have the chained inflation, all those types of things, and some fairly detailed terminology. Remember, terminology is important. That's the way the question will be asked on the exam in terms of the jargon and terminology you see in the curriculum. So you can't ignore that as you go through. Not much in the way of quantitative analysis in this reading, but a lot of background stuff for understanding economic activity and understanding the views of the macroeconomy and what we should be doing about the macroeconomy, which we discuss elsewhere in the curriculum. Good luck with this material.